there are always consequences. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. We are in episode 6 of season 8, beginning a new series on Netflix's The Fall of the House of Usher. So join us as we become more obsessed with Poe than we already are. All right, podcast listeners. It has become a bit of a tradition that whenever Mike Flanagan and his team have a new Netflix series out, that we watch it and we talk about it. We started off with The Haunting of Hill House, which of course we had to talk about because it was Shirley Jackson. We continued that with Henry James and The Haunting of Bly Manor. And I believe we talked about Midnight Mass. Mel, we've done a lot for this podcast. Did we talk about Midnight Mass?
We did not talk about Midnight Mass on the podcast, I don't think, but we did talk about the first episode of, was it The Midnight Club?
That was it. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to have to swing back into Midnight Mass now that I think about it. But to be fair, that was one of his own, I guess from his own mind is what I'm trying to say, and not based on any pre-existing literary history, which, you know, we're definitely interested in this podcast as we tend to look at horror history quite a bit. So it makes sense, I think, that we take a look at the fall of the House of Usher. So we're going to cover the first 2 episodes in this episode. So the first 2 episodes of the Fall of House of Usher. That's episode 1, A Midnight Dreary, and episode 2, The Mask of the Red Death. And we're going to continue on for a few more episodes. So right now, I'm going to put it at the top of the episode. Listeners, we are going to spoil these episodes. We may unintentionally spoil some things to come just as we talk about Poe in this series. So if you have not had a chance to watch The Fall of the House of Usher and you don't want it to be spoiled, then I would tell you to go ahead and pause this podcast episode and return to it once you've watched episode 1 and 2. That being said, I am one of those people who firmly believes that you can listen to something and talk about it and hear about it before watching it, and it really doesn't spoil anything because there's a certain art, I think, to adapting material like this, and it's going to be a joy to watch no matter what. So that's just my opinion on it, but we will be talking about the episodes in depth. So there is your spoiler warning. Okay, so before we get into it, I'll just, I guess, give a few of my own thoughts on this and a little, I guess, kind of crash course in what this is about. So I was curious to know how exactly Mike Flanagan was going to take something like The Fall of the House of Usher and make it into a miniseries. You know, it's a short story, and I was just like, I'm not really sure. You know, his past ones have been based on books. So, in fact, all of the ones we just mentioned, The Haunting of Bly Manor, The Haunting of Hill House, and The Midnight Club are all based on books. So there's much more real estate. And I was thinking, okay, I know he's probably going to delve into all of Poe, but how is this going to like fit around the fall of the House of Usher, since that is such a short story? And of course, he pulls it off. I mean, I shouldn't really be surprised. But the way he does it is that Roderick Usher is the main character, I would say, of this miniseries, in the same way that he is the main character of The Fall of the House of Usher. But Roderick Usher is a man who is running a basically like a big pharma drug company. And he has his children. I believe there are 6 children. in the Usher family. I may have that wrong because I realized I did not write any of that down in my notes. But
They're six.
okay, good. As soon as I said that, I was like, "Oh, is that right?" But yeah, there are six Usher children, and we know that some of or all of them are not around. It opens on, or maybe not opens, but it's around a funeral, and he is burying some of his children. So right away, it's kind of that, I think, play on like the fall of the House of Usher, because this is about a family. I kind of liken this, and I've seen people talk about it in this way, but this is, to me, it was like a gothic Succession. If any of you have seen that TV show, um, so it's like if Poe wrote that. So I kind of appreciated it, but um, we're going to get into a lot of the Poe references and stuff that we've seen in episode 1 and 2. But before we do that, Mel, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts, just kind of initial impressions of the fall of the House of Usher.
Sure, yeah. I'm pretty sure, Lisa, that you, well, pardon me if you already said this, but I don't think you did. You've already watched the whole thing, right? You've already watched all 8 episodes. Am I correct about that?
You are correct. In fact, that was probably why I stumbled and stammered so much going over my recap, just kind of getting into it, because I had to stop and think, wait a minute, am I spoiling things before it even gets started? Um, yeah, it was one of those shows that as soon as I started it, I really could not stop. So I've watched all of it. And listeners, if you remember our Bly Manor like episode series arc, Mel and I are kind of in reverse places, because I was watching that as we were recording these episodes, so I wasn't getting ahead of myself. But Matt and Mel had both already seen the entirety of it, so they knew what was coming.
The same with the
But
Haunting of
Mel,
Hill House, because you kept yelling
right?
at us about
Yeah,
spoilers. Yeah.
yeah. Well, this time you can yell at me about spoilers, because I'm gonna try not to.
Well, I mentioned that partially because I totally understand why it would be hard for you to synopsize these first 2 episodes because of that, but also because, as you said, I'm watching it as we go. So I've only seen the first 2 episodes. But I feel like if you know anything about Poe, there are going to be certain things that we say, me unknowingly, and Lisa maybe knowing a little bit more than me, that may give things away. I think that's kind of the beauty of it in a way. And I loved in Hill House and Bly Manor how Flanagan found ways to throw in Easter eggs from the author's other works, which, if you're interested in going back and listening to those, we actually did mini episodes on the Henry James stories that were involved in Bly Manor, whereas our main episodes, I think, focused more on the turn of the screw in the show itself. But with that said, I'll give my impressions. One thing I was thinking when you mentioned you've watched all 8 episodes and it's hard for you to recap the first 2, is I was, even though I've only watched 2 episodes, I was thinking it's hard for me to recap because one, I got way more kind of into it than I was expecting. I was taking notes, so my notes aren't as detailed as I would like, I suppose, doing something like this, just because I was trying to piece together what was going on. Because, two, listeners, if you haven't already watched it, this is not a problem with the show. This is one of the things I like about the show, but it makes it hard to recap, and that you're going back and forth in time. So I think the longest back we go is like the mid to late 1970s. There's this one particular moment in like the late 70s and the early 80s that they keep going back to, and then we're in the present day, like literally the present day. At one point, the prosecutor who is after the ushers for their crimes mentions the dates, and it's approximately like around the time the show came out. But I think that makes it hard to recap too, because you are kind of unmoored in time as you get the story. And so it's all fitting together, but there is that kind of shift in time period to see the young versions of the actors, or the young versions of the characters and what they do. And then we also have this character, Verna, who is really fascinating to me, whose name is, an anagram of Raven. and sometimes there is a raven who I assume is connected to her. And she's this really interesting figure that seems to never age and just like pops up in weird places. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about her, but she seems to be a watching, observing type figure. And I was super intrigued when in the December 31st, 1979 part where Madeline and Roderick have done something and are getting ready to start on their future when they're going to change the world, which they say over and over again. She mentions at some point that their lives are going to change that evening and that they're sitting outside of time and space. And she does some other weird stuff with time, with the son Prospero, who dies in episode 2. And one of the things that I remember distinctly from The Haunting of Hill House was the working in of a few direct quotes from Doctor Who, about time and space that was related to grief and loss in that particular incarnation. And so I'm really interested in seeing if this is just some like um, flashy, interesting dialogue from a mysterious character, or if there's something going on. Because I think we all know by now that I do like weird time and space things. I agree with you, Lisa. I think it's interesting the updating of the story, to have, in the story, Roderick and Madeline are the only ones in the house, and Roderick is ill with some mysterious illness. Roderick here has a type of vascular dementia. We don't find that out until episode 2. And with the loss of his children and his illness getting worse, he invites the prosecutor who has been after them for years, Dupin, who is a takeoff of Poe's famous private investigator detective that he created in his mystery stories, to the House of Usher, I guess, or the childhood home. And he is going to give his confession. So instead of having a friend come to visit him and help him, like in the story, in this part, the House of Usher is haunted by the children who have died, and Roderick is looking to tell his story to someone before he passes away. And as Lisa, you and I talked about, I think it was yesterday or the day before, he keeps saying that Madeline is in the basement. And I think if you've read the story, again, it's like, possibly, maybe what's coming. I don't know because I've only watched 2 episodes, but that kind of got my attention. And so, yeah, I really kind of like that idea too of this, I don't know, updating of it. There's this implication in a couple lines in the story that there may be something weird about the Usher past. And in the Vincent Price movie, Roderick is upset because his family has like not been great in the past. There's some sort of like nastiness there that he's trying to stop by burying Madeline prematurely. So I think, I mean, you can pull little threads from the Roger Corman movie and the original story, I think, to make this make sense. And so Roderick is a really haunted guy. He's haunted by a raven from a poem, and he's haunted by his children whose names come from various Poe stories and poems, and he's kind of haunted by this pursuit that he's been going through his life. And I think Roderick and Madeline are kind of haunted by the loss of their mother, who they accidentally buried before she was fully dead. Of course, the mother was named Eliza, which is the name of Poe's mother. It's another connection. So I feel like talking about these first 2 episodes is just basically a lot of, oh, look at that name, that's from this, and look at that name, and that's from this, which I don't mind. I'm not saying that's bad. I like seeing all the different Easter eggs and gestures, but I do feel like Bly Manor focused a lot on Turn of the Screw and the Romance of Old Clothes, and The Haunting of Hill House focused much on Hill House with some other stuff pulled in. I feel like this Poe one is I don't want to say fast and loose because that sounds negative, but it is a very kind of, you have to create a new central story to make it all fit together. But I'm really liking the connections that are being made so far.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think I will be completely honest that with and I mean it had to be done this way, I think, because he's dealing with short stories and not a novel, or as with the case of Bly Manor, like maybe like 2 longer texts that he could kind of pull from. And so he does have to do a lot of heavy lifting with these characters and kind of build his own storylines that make sense. Um, and so in the first episode, one thing I do remember when I was watching it is thinking, how is all of this going to work in a way that feels satisfying to me? um, I wasn't really sure how it was going to all come together. And I don't want to say like I was suspicious like that. It wasn't quite that. Um, I wasn't quite that worried about it because I've seen enough of his stuff to know that I was going to enjoy it. But I agree with you. A lot of watching the first episode for me was just, I mean, kind of pointing at the screen and being like, I know where that's from. Whether it's like the characters' names or that kind of thing. And I was, at first it was a little off-putting, I think, having like Dupont be the narrator coming to visit Roderick in the beginning and kind of hearing his story, because in the fall of the House of Usher, of course, you have a friend who's coming to visit Roderick, and that's kind of the framework of how the story is told. But Dupont is from a completely different Poe universe, basically. He appears in several stories, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, for one. What is the other one? The Purloined Letter?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And does he appear in Marie Roget, or am I just misremembering?
I think so. It's been a while since I've dusted off my Poe book, I will admit.
Well, Marie Roget is like a deep, deep cut. I don't think a lot of people
Right.
read that.
Yeah, but I was kind of like, wait, Dupont doesn't show up in this story. Like, how are we going to cross all these characters? Plus, and as you alluded to, knowing these stories so well, knowing that Madeline is in the basement, if you've read the story, that's not going to end well, that she's probably not alive, or if she's alive, she maybe wasn't alive a few minutes ago. Like, because there's all kinds of, sinister things are happening with Madeline in the basement. Where I was waiting, I was like, well, when, I guess the house can't come down yet, but it's called The Fall of the House of Usher, and in the Poe story, the house crumbles. When is it going to crumble? It was that kind of like feeling, I think, when I was watching the first episode. By episode 2, and definitely by the time I got into episode 3, I felt much more secure in like the new story that was being built here, in the way I did with like Bly Manor or something. So but yeah, I feel like the disorienting might be a good word for like the first episode, because I was just trying to place where I knew everything from. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe we should talk a little bit about Roderick and Madeline and their like origin story, since we get a little bit of it in episode 1. You mentioned that I felt like kind of rushed through it a little bit, but the idea of the fact that their mother was sick and they had to bury her. At first, I was thinking that this was going to be maybe Mike Flanagan playing with a little bit more of religious trauma like he did in Midnight Mass, just because their mother is presented as a very like strict religious person. And that seems like, I mean, almost on a kind of borderline religious abuse that was happening in the home, kind of akin to like a Carrie type situation, although maybe not that bad. Um, but when the fact that they had to bury her themselves as children in their backyard because they didn't know what to do, because they were like, she won't want to be cremated, you know so we have to, or she won't want to be embalmed, like her religious beliefs cover that, so we have to take it on ourselves. And of course, then knowing Poe, premature burial is going to come up at least once, if not more than once. um because that was just a frequent topic in Poe stories where people getting buried alive and getting buried before their time and popping back from the dead. Um, it was a very, I thought, well done like sequence of events that happened with the mother. But Mel, what was your take on that?
Well, I think you covered it pretty well. I mean, I fully expected when the children felt like they had to bury the mother that there was going to be this like return return of the mother. And again, you have, so if you think about like the return of Madeline at the end of the story, the fall of the House of Usher, this like, I mean, she first tries to hurt her children and then ends up going and killing. So basically, she was secretary to the guy that was running this Fortunato drug company, which is the company that the Ushers, Roderick and Madeline, run in the present day. We don't know yet how they got to that situation, that we have a feeling it has something to do with whatever happened on December 31st, 1979. But she was in a relationship with her married boss. And so the two kids, if I'm remembering correctly, are his, but he has a family and lives in a completely different place than them. And the kids keep kind of trying to go to that house because I guess they know something's up, and she's been strictly told not to be anywhere near him. So in this rage of kind of, I don't know, coming back from the dead or being buried early because the kids didn't realize that she wasn't actually fully dead, um, she kind of like, I guess, like seeks vengeance on him. Like she attacks him, she kills him, and it's kind of covered up what happened apparently, if I'm remembering correctly there. Um, so this not only is like something out of a Poe story, which it is, but this also leads to Roderick's kind of mission to take this opioid drug for pain and sell it to everybody. So the idea is this actually isn't addictive and anyone can take it. You can take it if you're like banged up in a terrible automobile accident, like his young wife in the present day. That's how he met her, because she was taking it when she was in the hospital. Or if you just have a headache, you could take it. So you get this like high powered pain pill that's being, he wants to market it to everybody from like children on up for practically anything. And he says that this is because his mother had experienced such horrific pain in her life. And so this is his way of like changing the world, as they say. Um, and so I guess in some ways their ideas or the things that they're doing came from a place of trying to help, but we can see in the present that it's basically become, I mean, they basically just have a lot of money and a lot of privilege and they're doing whatever the heck they want. And it doesn't really, nobody else really matters. They're getting sued for putting toxic chemicals in the environment and sued for their addictive opioid drug, and kind of a rip from the headlines thing. And they have to have a fixer, who's Mark Hamill's character. I guess you would call him that. He's a lawyer, but he also tries to make things go away for them. So, what started supposedly as a way to help people after what happened to their mom, as they rose up, I'm presuming, and they got more power and more money, it ends up becoming more like trying to survive, I guess. So that's why this prosecutor has been after them from the time he was a fraud investigator until now. Um, but yeah, I feel like that's that kind of what happened with her mom, from the abuse to the not having a father figure, to seeing what the mom did, to the pain that she went through. All of that kind of motivates them, I guess, in a way, not to excuse the things they do, but pushes them forward. I mean, even Roderick says that the reason the reason he has adopted into the family the children he had with several other women, um, is because he saw how things were when a father wouldn't be responsible for their children, and he didn't want to do that. So even though he doesn't treat them like his first two children, that he had his first wife, Annabel Lee, who he wrote the Annabel Lee poem for, not Edgar Allan Poe, I guess. um, he at least tries, I guess, in some ways. He's affected by that moment. So a lot of what Roderick and Madeline are doing, I think, has to do with what happened to them as children. This may be slightly off track, but I don't think so, to a certain extent. But like Madeline is doing different things. I thought that was interesting, that she's kind of into math and algorithms and technology before it, in the early days of it. And she's like working on like AI immortality or something. And so thinking about the Madeline character getting this kind of story is really interesting to me. The idea of being able to like outlast death and create personas for yourself, and I don't know, it's really fascinating to me when you think of the Madeline character in the story, um, that this Madeline would be in those kind of thinking of those kind of things and doing those sorts of things. And I don't know what's going on between her and the brother, but I mean, I can only imagine.
Yeah, we won't really say I won't say much. I'm trying to just mute myself from saying anything as you're going over this, because there's so much that is like revealed a
Basically, I'm
few
just predicting everything
a
without having
few
watched it.
episodes down the road. But what I will say is, yeah, I think you did a really great job with that. The episode one, because I want to talk about episode two as well, but episode one, I think, does a really good job of just kind of setting up who these characters are, and really kind of focusing on Roderick and Madeline and some of their early formative moments that are going to inform what happens later. Because we get a few more things in this. There's really, for me, there were two, I think, big mysteries that propel the story forward in the series that were set up in episode one. I mean, obviously, the first is going to be who's killing the Usher family. Like, what is happening? We don't know really how they die. We don't know any of that early on. But then there's also when we get kind of young, like not child Roderick and Madeline, but um, the young, I guess, in their 20s, Roderick and Madeline, when they're first setting up this idea for this drug and all this. We get that something happened on New Year's Eve. I want to say it was New Year's Eve 1980, but I also did not write that down.
It's
So,
1979.
okay, close enough. um, so, yeah, that it was New Year's Eve 1979. And all we know is that they've come in from somewhere else and they're having to set up an alibi, basically. It's just kind of like, make sure people see us here. And that's where we meet the mysterious Verna character, which you mentioned at the top of the episode is a anagram of Raven. So obviously she is going to be in some way um, significant. But I think that that's really fascinating that they that we kind of have this um these two moments, I guess, or these two mysteries moving us forward, and that's going to be what propels the story going on for the miniseries to continue. And I think it is set up really well in that. I do want to talk about episode two as well, because this episode was, I don't know if fun is the right word for it. I use the word fun only in the sense of, as soon as I realized what Poe's story we were in, I was like, oh, we're gonna, things are gonna start happening here. So basically, episode one is them setting up a lot of the world and the story. Episode two, we really kind of get into the Poe characters quite a bit, and in this one in particular is the Mask of the Red Death is that. And you mentioned earlier the Roger Corman movies. So Roger Corman did quite a few Poe adaptations. He had Vincent Price in a lot of them. And one thing that I really liked is that, for the most part, this series is like a Poe purist series. I mean, it really does some deep dives into like Poe's own biography and his works, and not just the short stories, but the poems and the novel, as we'll talk about with the character of Pym. But there's also some nice references to like the Vincent Price adaptations. And I thought in this one in particular, I saw some of that, um, which was kind of nice to see. But basically, in episode 2, we see a little bit more of the Usher children. And in particular, we see the youngest Usher child, who is one of, so there are the 2 original Usher children, I guess, who came from Annabelle Lee, and then the rest are from dalliances, as you mentioned. This is Perry, so this is Prospero. Um, and he decides that he is going to throw a party, and it's going to be very exclusive, and it's going to be, very like sex, drugs, rock and roll type of vibes, kind of eyes wide shut a little bit, I guess. But basically, you can't get in unless you're on the list, and you have to pay a certain amount of money. And it's a way for him to make money very quickly, because his father won't give him the money to start up his own business venture. And he's a little bit upset by that. So it's kind of like, well, I'm going to show my father that I don't need him, kind of thing. But as in The Mask of the Red Death, anytime you throw a big party, and it's a Poe story, it's kind of like, getting buried alive. Nobody's getting out of this alive. And I will say, listeners, if you don't like gore, this episode, I feel like, is one of the worst of the series as far as what happens. But again, I'm going to turn it over to Mel since it was her first time watching it. But what did you think of episode 2?
Well, I think you covered a lot of the major points. I think when you, like you said, anytime you have someone throwing a party and they're calling it, then the episode's The Mask of Red Death, you know that not so good things are going to happen. I think the episode does a good job of what you were saying, like getting us into the story of one of the children who died and how that happened. But also at the same time carrying on some of the world building, I guess, from the first episode. Like we start seeing through the interactions of the characters kind of what their relationships are like. Not like any of the siblings really have good relationships with each other, but we found out in episode 1 that supposedly one of the family had turned informant to the prosecutor, to the government. And we still don't know who it was, unless I missed something. And so it sets off the family. Basically, they all just turn on each other. So Madeline is going to do like some big investigation and has them sign these forms. And Roderick basically just puts a bounty on the person's head of a bunch of money. And so he wants his kids basically to rat each other out, which they're happy to do. They don't really seem to care about each other. They just kind of see each other as obstacles to get where they want to go. And so in this episode, we see that the youngest, Perry, as he likes to go by, which I mean, if your name's Prospero, I can understand why you want people to call you Perry. And he's, like you said, just trying to prove himself to his father and kind of to the other siblings as well. But we see how kind of cutthroat they become. He has no earthly clue what's going on with the business. And so he messes up everything when he shows up at the toxic chemical meeting with Pym and the oldest, Frederick. And all he can think about is how to do this plan to make this money. And so he ends up choosing one of the condemned and closed labs that the Usher's drug company used that's been accused of housing toxic chemicals, and he doesn't even pay attention to what's going on. So I mean, spoiler for the end of this episode, he doesn't understand that the water tanks are actually holding acid and other toxic chemicals, which ends up killing all the people at his party in a really disturbing scene of events. But yeah, it's basically kind of his willful ignorance and his kind of obsession with himself and his position that causes him to not realize this. And so you see during the course of the episode him kind of blithely disregarding his family members or using them in certain ways to get things he needs. He seems particularly kind of cutthroat with Frederick's wife, Morella. Of course, that character has their own story in the Poe's Morella, um, which she does not go to the Mask of the Red Death in the story, but here she does. And you get the feeling he's kind of trying to have vengeance on Frederick. He's trying to get her in trouble, basically. But that's the flip side to it too. Is like you're saying, Lisa. It's not just a way to make quick money, but he is videotaping all of these people, and he invited them because he knew they had secrets that he could blackmail them with. So he's gathering evidence to blackmail all these people and make tons of more money. So the whole thing is pretty much suspect from top to bottom, what he's doing. But in some ways, he kind of feels like this is the only way that he can kind of get some respect in his family. Because in the previous episode, we know that he told Madeline and Roderick that he wanted his steak that they give all the kids so that he could do this idea of these unhinged parties. And they basically said, no, you need to figure out how to do something that changes the world. Um, Not just giving parties basically. So he's trying to show them that this gives him power. And yeah, I think after this, I'll throw it back to you, Lisa. But I agree with you that the touches from the Roger Corman movie and the story itself are both great because we get the mysterious character Verna back again. This time, she has a red cloak and a skull, like a skeleton, I guess, like mask, and she comes and gives Perry a chance to stop it all, to end the party and not do what he's going to do. She talks about how he doesn't have much time left, which, of course, he's a young man who's high and at this great party, and he sees tons of money coming his way and doesn't want to pay attention to her. And she talks about how time always equals consequences and that she's kind of there to try to stop him. He refuses to stop, and she goes and tells all the innocent people in the building to leave, and they like get the heck out of there. So yeah, there's also more implicate or more of implied supernatural presence to her than there was in episode 1 and episode 2 because she's moving around very quickly. She knows all sorts of stuff maybe she shouldn't know. And when she tells Morella to get out, it's like almost like she wasn't visible the whole time. So Verna's still creepy and weird, and I'm very intrigued by her. But it seems like whatever happened in December 31st, 1979, there are consequences for it that are falling down on the family. And even though she gave Perry a chance to turn away from it, I don't think she really believed that he would. So it was just kind of a pause before the final downfall of that particular character. I get the impression that a lot of the episodes from here on out are just going to focus on one dead kid at a time.
I would say that you're right. That it's going to kind of do that. And I will say largely, I don't think this is really any spoilers either, but each episode does kind of do a better job from this point out at like honing in on one Poe story and focusing around that while also keeping the story that was built in episode 1 going. So it does become a little bit, I don't know. I think that's why I found episode 1 a little disorienting because I couldn't like place it with a direct Poe story, but then once I could for the rest of them, it felt a little bit easier for me. Yeah, I think your reading of kind of Perry's plight, I guess, in this episode is absolutely right. I will also say it's fun, question mark, and gruesome in the way that because of course in the original story, Prospero is a prince and he's trying to outrun death. He's trying to There's the Red Death, the plague that is happening outside, and so he gets a bunch of his, basically his rich friends together, and he's like, "Well, we're just going to close ourselves off, and we're going to be fine, and just wait until the plague runs its course outside, and then we'll be able to go outside and not have to worry about it." But of course, you can't do that, and it ends up finding them. In the story itself, the Red Death kills very quickly, but with particularly like gruesome side effects, I guess is would be the word, but including profuse bleeding at the pores, which I thought was very well illustrated by the end of this episode. um, but yeah, I liked Perry as a character. I hated that he didn't make it very long. But I did like this episode probably more, I think, than I did the first. And I agree with you, Verna. At this point, we know now that she's something else than just human, because she hasn't aged a day since we last saw her on New Year's Eve in 1979. So I think that's something uh, that is really fun. A kind of a fun mystery, I guess, to look at here. Um, I will also say, since you mentioned it, Morella is, I think, one of those. It's another one of those, I think, deeper cuts in the Poe um, canon. But Morella is, from what I remember, she's a mother who has a daughter and she dies, and then the daughter doesn't the daughter kind of grow up to look more and more like her,
Yeah,
and it
basically the
freaks the
daughter's like a
father out.
mini Morella. Yeah, because
Yeah,
Morella threatened like to put herself in the daughter, right? Like the daughter would be like
right.
her second coming. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and it scares the father, But um Poe, and you mentioned it kind of already with Annabelle Lee, because again, once somebody is named Annabelle Lee, like, probably she's not long for this world. um but Poe in particular had a lot of his kind of dying women in his stories, and Morella was one of them. And I don't know, I just kind of want to, like, put that in your mind, in the back of your brain, as you continue watching.
Well,
What?
the wonderful, likable granddaughter is Lenore, so I worry for her.
Well, yeah, Lenore is another one of his beautiful dying women. So, um, yeah, yeah, it'll be interesting. Do it.
Okay. Yeah, Lisa, another thing I thought was interesting is that in both episode 1 and 2, the granddaughter, who has a pretty good relationship with Roderick, calls him, since he's her grandfather, she calls him Grampus. And I think it would be really easy for people who aren't familiar with Poe's work to kind of gloss over that and think that's just what she calls her grandfather. But the Grampus was actually the whaling ship in the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym that Pym takes off on. And so I don't know, it's kind of interesting that Roderick is kind of like the head of this Usher ship that's completely falling apart. And you have the Grampus, which, if I'm remembering correctly from Pym, this is the ship that everything just fell apart and they got lost. And there was like cannibalism, not unlike people starting to pick each other off. So yeah, just a lot of crazy things happening. And so it gets mentioned again when Lenore is actually doing a ship in a bottle type thing, and it's named the Grampus. So uh, Pym keeps popping up in really interesting ways, and I'm wondering if it's just gestures at it or if it's actually going to become more important in some strange way. And one last thing I want to say before we kind of move on is that listeners, if you're interested in these Roger Corman Poe films, we actually did a series on some of those. I think it was back during like kind of the height of the pandemic. I'm sure you can go back in our backlist and find them, but we did an episode on the Mask of the Red Death with Vincent Price. And so if you're interested in checking out those or checking it out and then listening to our conversation about it, that could be a good backlist episode to go to. So I think Lisa and I are going to stop here. I still have to go watch episodes 3 and 4 to get ready for our next discussion. And I'm sure Lisa's probably afraid she might spoil something for me. So we'll pause here. We hope you enjoyed hearing us give our impressions and talk just a little bit about the Poe connections in these first 2 episodes. I was highly disturbed by the people melting in the acid rain, but I'm going to push on because I want to find out what happens. I want to find out what's going on with this Verna character and find out what's going on with some of these cool Poe connections. So, with that, We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram, and we have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, please consider supporting us on Patreon. We were doing mini episodes there that would kind of back up or add to our main episodes. We've hit pause on creating new minis, but there's a whole backlist of mini episodes you could check out there. Or if you don't want to or cannot support us financially at this point, you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free on whatever podcast app you use, and it helps other listeners find us. Our theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.